All right, so these are bonuses and toss-ups that are drawn from NAQT, the set of questions that I've gathered over the years. And essentially, of the 76 toss-ups that are here from non-national championship level questions, I'm going to divide it into two short videos of 36 questions each. So let's go ahead and start, and hopefully you can use this to study economics. It is usually contrasted with the law of demand for 10 points each. Name this economic law which states that more something costs, the more it will be produced. And that is the law of supply. Aggregate supply and demand for an economy are often plotted in a cross name for this economist who wrote the general theory of employment, interest, and money. And that is John Maynard Keynes. In this effect, greater numbers of alternative but identically consumable goods enter the market, competing for the demand and driving down supply. And that is the substitution effect. Number two, Pigovian, this is a toss-up. Pigovian taxes are designed to compensate for the effects of these phenomena, which can create deadweight loss in some circumstances. As long as transaction costs are negligible, they will not prevent a transaction from being efficient, according to Coase's theorem. For 10 points, name either positive or negative unintended consequences of economic activity which lead to the free rider problem. That is an externality, Number three, which is a bonus. A situation called a liquidity trap can prevent the government from correcting for this. For 10 points each, name this situation in which prices rise across an entire economy. That is inflation. Part B, inflation is calculated relative to this index, which measures the prices of a bundle of typically purchased goods like gasoline and food. That is the Consumer Price Index, Part C, this economist wrote about the dangers of inflation, among other things, in Capitalism and Freedom. And that is Milton Friedman. Number four, a toss-up. Jack Kemp's governmental policies supported this theory, although opposing economists, including Keynesians, argue that policies of this type caused stagflation in the 1970s. This theory is supported by the Laffer curve and embraced by Ronald Reagan's economic advisors. For 10 points, name this theory of economics which advocates governmental aid for the wealthiest producers. And that is supply-side economics, also known as trickle-down economics. I would prompt on Reaganomics, but supply-side economics. Toss-up number five, a bonus. A key idealization of modern economics is that a market is governed by perfect competition. For 10 points each, under those circumstances, it is assumed that no single buyer or seller is large enough for its decisions to affect this quantity, denoted P. And that is price, equilibrium price. It assumes that this kind of cost is zero. These are costs like shipping and consumer research that are not paid by the buyer to the seller. And the answer there is the transaction cost. Part C. It also assumes that none of these entities exist. They include any obstacle that would prevent a firm from starting to manufacture the good. That would be the barrier 2. So, number six, a toss-up. This man speculated about the current account surplus of secessionist New York City in his article, The East is in the Red, which dismissed worries about China's trade surplus. He called inflation a phantom menace and warned of a dark age of macroeconomics in his 2012 book, End This Depression Now. For 10 points, the 2008 Nobel Prize in Economics was won by what liberal columnist for the New York Times? That is Paul Krugman. Number seven, a bonus. This concept is divided into M1, M2, and M3, which encompass increasingly diverse forms of it. For 10 points each, name this medium of exchange in a modern economy. That is money, not currency. No accepting or prompting on currency. Money. This economist wrote the general theory of employment, interest, and money. He advocated government spending to stimulate depressed economies. And that is John Maynard Keynes. This concept is the measure of how often a particular dollar is spent over a particular period of time. And that is the velocity of money. Number eight, a bonus. In 1759, he wrote that we may often fulfill all the roles of justice by sitting still and doing nothing. For 10 points each, name the Scottish Enlightenment author of the theory of moral sentiments. That is Adam Smith. Smith's concept of an invisible hand appears in this 1776 book. That is The Wealth of Nations. Full name, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, but just said The Wealth of Nations is fine. Part C. Smith opposed the ideas of this French economic school founded by the author of Tableau Économique, Francois Quesnay, and that is the Physiocrats, or the Physiocratic school. Number 9, a bonus. It was created in 1913 to address bank panics and serve as the central bank of the United States. For 10 points each, name this system overseen by a 7-person board of governors selected by the president. That's the Fed, or the Federal Reserve. In September 2012, the Federal Reserve announced that it was instituting the third round of this program of buying assets to stimulate the economy. That is quantitative easing. Part C, the Fed has a dual mandate to keep two rates low. Some critics claim that quantitative easing temporarily lowers unemployment but causes this rate to increase. And that is the inflation rate. Number 10, a toss-up. West Coast Hotel Company v. Parrish upheld legislation that created this concept, which was established in Britain by the 1909 Trade Boards Act. David Card and Alan Kruger argued that New Jersey's 1992 increase in this value did not adversely affect employment rates. For 10 points, $7.25 is the current federal standard for what economic value, the lowest hourly rate that most workers may legally be paid. And that is the minimum wage. Number 11, a toss-up. J.R. Clark and Dwight Lee used this kind of diagram to assess the risks of climbing Mount McKinley. Hal Varian wrote that its use in public policy was a sordid history that did not account for elasticity of the labor supply. This figure was sketched on a napkin by a supply-side economist. Rates of taxation and revenue are plotted on, for 10 points, what curve named for Ronald Reagan's economic advisor? And that is the Laffer curve. Toss-up number 12. This economic indicator is found by adding the unemployment rate to the rate of inflation. For 10 points each, Part A, name this indicator developed by Arthur Okun during the Carter administration. And that would be the misery index. The misery index. Part B, the misery index is large in this macroeconomic situation of high inflation, high unemployment, and low economic growth rates. Is stagflation. Stagflation in the 1970s led to decreased support for the ideas of this British economist who called for increased government spending during recessions. That is John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes. Number 13, which is a bonus. For 10 points each, name these quantities that measure consumers' relations with the market. This quantity is the amount of a good people are willing to purchase at a given price. And that is demand. The happiness or benefit of a consumer gains for a purchased good is expressed by this quantity, whose marginal value generally diminishes in a consumption of the good as consumption of the good increases. And that is the utility. This value can be calculated from a price-quantity graph by finding the area between the price and demand curves. It is the difference between what a purchaser is willing to pay and the amount actually paid. And that is the consumer surplus. Consumer surplus. Number 14, a bonus. For 10 points each, name these quantities that measure consumers' relations with the market. This quantity is the... Oh, sorry about that. This is a repeat. So I'll move on to number 15. In one work, this economist claimed that self-preservation replaces maximized profit for large corporations controlled by a technostructure. He grouped teachers, engineers, and surgeons into a new class in a work that criticized the private sector for marginalizing public investment and popularized the phrase conventional wisdom. For 10 points, name this author of The New Industrial State and the Affluent Society. That is John Kenneth Galbraith. Number 16, a bonus. He advocated the implementation of a free market in Free to Choose, a work co-authored with his wife, Rose. For 10 points each, name this economist and developer of monetarism who wrote A Monetary History of the United States with Anna Schwartz. And that is Milton Friedman. Part B, Milton Friedman, Robert Coase, and Frank Knight were members of this school of economics named after a Midwestern university. And that is the Chicago School. In this 1962 work, Friedman proposes vouchers for private education as well as the implementation of a flat tax and a floating exchange rate. And that is Capitalism and Freedom. Toss-up 17. In the 1820s, this man engaged in a debate with a proponent of free trade of the concepts of the general glut and economic rent. This contemporary of David Ricardo used the pseudonym Joseph Johnson for an essay that inspired the Census Act of 1800. For 10 points, name this British economist who wrote an essay on the principle of population and argued that food supply increases linearly while population increases geometrically. And that is Thomas Malthus. 18, a bonus. A tax on gains in this quantity is paid on investments sold at a profit. For 10 points each, name this term that describes the assets used to produce goods and services. Karl Marx wrote an 1867 Critique of Political Economy titled after this term. and that is capital, or capital. In economics part B, the three traditional factors of production are land, capital, and this concept, the work done by people, and that is labor. In this French economist's 2014 bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century, he argued that wealth inequality is inevitable because income from capital will always grow faster than labor income. And that is Thomas Piketty. 19, a bonus. In October 2014, Janet Yellen announced that the so-called taper had finally ended. For 10 points each, Yellen heads the board of governors of this government institution that sets U.S. monetary policy. And that would be the Fed, or Federal Reserve System. The taper was the gradual end to the third round of this policy of purchasing bonds to inject money into the economy and stimulate demand. And that is quantitative easing. Quantitative easing was carried out by this committee that buys and sells treasury securities and other assets in public fora. And that is the Federal Open Market Committee. Of course, the current Fed chair is Jerome Powell, no longer Janet Yellen, who is the current, as of 2021, Secretary of the Treasury. Toss-up number 20. For 10 points each, name these economic curves. This is a bonus. The intersection of this curve with the demand curve determines the equilibrium price of an object, and that is the supply curve. Part B, this curve suggests that an inverse relationship between taxation and unemployment. Naive analysis based on this curve was proven incorrect by the stagflation of the 1970s. That is the Phillips curve. This curve indicating that there exist points where lowering taxes increases revenue became a major influence on supply-side economics. And that is the Laffer curve. 21, a bonus. This situation can arise naturally when fixed costs are high. For 10 points each, name the situation in which a market is dominated by one seller. That is a monopoly. Monopolists generally raise this value for a good, thus reducing the quantity sold. They may also engage in a type of discrimination named for this value. That would be the price. Because raising the price moves away from equilibrium, it will introduce this type of economic loss in which the total consumer plus producer surplus falls. That would be a deadweight loss. 22, which is a bonus. This period of time coincided with the Dust Bowl, and it began with the stock market crash in 1929. For 10 points each, name this economic downturn that Franklin D. Roosevelt combated with his New Deal. That is the Great Depression. St. Louis was the site of the largest one of these shanty towns built during the Great Depression. They were nicknamed for the president in office during the stock market crash. And those are Hoovervilles. Among Hoover's attempts to battle the Depression was his signing of an act of this type named for Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley. And that is a tariff. 23, a toss-up. This man argued that society consists of a base and a superstructure in the preface to a work about political economy. This man asserted that a specter is haunting Europe in a pamphlet co-written with Frederick Engels. For 10 points, name this co-author of the Communist Manifesto. And that is Karl Marx. 24, a bonus. In France, one of these policies was called the taille, or tile. For 10 points each, name these financial measures levied by the state. In California, the sales one can be as high as 10%. Those are taxes. Part B, taxes are distortions that can move markets away from this condition in which supply and demand are matched. And that is market equilibrium. Part C, a triangle-shaped region on a supply and demand curve corresponds to this type of loss, which is zero when the market is in equilibrium. And that is a deadweight loss. 25, which is a bonus. This type of economic policy involves controlling interest rates and the printing of money. For 10 points each, Part A, name this type of policy often contrasted with fiscal policy. That would be monetary policy. Part B, this British economist wrote about using monetary and fiscal policy to control recessions in his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. That is John Maynard Keynes. Part C, this free market economist and Anna Schwartz wrote A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960, in which they argued that tight monetary policy caused the Great Depression. And of course, that is Milton Friedman. 26, a bonus. In Marxism, this kind of value refers to a return on investment. Price discrimination is a tactic to cut into the consumer form of it, a term that describes how much people value a product over what they paid. For 10 points, give this economic term for the opposite of shortage. And that is a surplus. 27, a toss-up. An individual's fear of this phenomenon is measured by the Arrow-Pratt factor. Prospect theory examines how the perception of this phenomenon affects decision-making. The capital asset pricing model says that assets with a high value of this quantity should promise a higher long-term payout. For 10 points, name this measurement of uncertainty in a financial transaction, which economic actors measure against reward. and that is risk. Toss-up, or 28, which is a bonus. This economist said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. For 10 points each, part A. Name this libertarian economist who championed monetarism and wrote the book Capitalism and Freedom. And that is Milton Friedman. Friedman worked with other economists to devise the withholding system for collecting this source of government revenue, which is subject to many deductions. That is income tax. Part C, 1968, Friedman criticized this curve that suggested that there was an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation in an economy. And that is the Phillips curve. 29, a toss-up. The first welfare theorem states that a condition named for this man is satisfied by competitive equilibria. A type of power law distribution is named for this man because of his observation that about 20% of the population owns 80% of the total wealth. An allocation displays his namesake efficiency, if no one can be made better off without making another worse. For 10 points, name this Italian economist. And that is Vilfredo Pareto. The Pareto efficiency. 30, a bonus. Because this system viewed international trade as a zero-sum game, it placed value on exports and high import duties. For 10 points each, name this economic school of thought that sought a positive balance of trade and dictated the policies of European colonial powers in the 16th and 17th centuries. That is mercantilism. This country's mercantilist initiatives included the passage of the Navigation Acts and the conversion of the fens to agricultural lands. That is the UK, or Great Britain. Part C, this author of The Wealth of Nations was a critic of Britain's mercantilist policies. That is, of course, Adam Smith. 31, a toss-up. The right to create this thing can result in seigniorage. Bad forms of it drive out the good, according to Gresham's law. Classifications such as MO and M1 make up its supply. For 10 points, so what do economists define as something that can be exchanged for goods and services? And that is money. 32, a toss-up. This city contains the headquarters of the Fabian Society, which advocated gradual expansion of socialism and founded this city's namesake School of Economics. In this city, a coffeehouse called Lloyd's became a major insurance market. The LIBOR interest rate is set in by banks in this city, such as Barclays, period. Canary Wharf is in, for 10 points, what capital city whose financial sector will probably hurt by Brexit? And that is, of course, London. The next one, number 33, which is a bonus. This shape was supposedly sketched on a napkin at a 1974 meeting with Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. For 10 points each, name this curve whose highest point indicates a maximum value for government revenue. And that is, of course, the Laffer curve. Part B, the x-axis of a standard Laffer curve indicates rates for this economic concept, whose income form was legalized in the United States by the 16th Amendment. And that is, of course, taxes. Arthur Laffer's book about financial decision-making for the 80s was titled For This Kind of Economics, often said to have major influence on the Reagan administration. And that is supply-side economics. 34, toss-up. Robert J. Gordon developed the triangle model of this phenomenon, which, according to Keynesian economics, is caused by demand-pull or cost-push factors. The Phillips curve plots this measure against unemployment. Zimbabwe suffered the hyper version of this phenomenon caused by printing too much money. Changes in the consumer price index are used to measure, for 10 points, what general rise in prices over time. And that is inflation. Toss-up 30 or 35, a bonus. The public type of this economic concept is non-excludable and non-rivalrous and includes things such as fresh air and national defense. For 10 points each, name this economic concept refers to tangible materials and is contrasted with services. That would, of course, be goods. This type of good, named for a Scottish economist, is a special type of inferior good that violates the law of demand, because demand for it rises with price. Potatoes during the Irish famine were thought once to be a type of this good. That is a Giffen good, Part C, the law of demand is also violated by a type of luxury good named for this thinker who coined the term conspicuous consumption in his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. And that is Thorstein Veblen. 36, a bonus. A namesake deflator is used when calculating this measure to adjust for inflation. For 10 points each, name this measure of the size of a country's economy. It is contrasted with an older measure called GNP. That is the GDP, or the gross domestic product. In the Solow model, growth of a country's GDP comes from increases in productivity, labor, and this final factor input, which is often symbolized K. That is capital. Capital can be accumulated via this economic activity, which can be interpreted as consumers deferring consumption in a manner that is typically less risky than investment. Is savings. 37, a toss-up. This economist proposed a K% rule for increasing the money supply. He blamed the Federal Reserve for the Great Depression in A Monetary History of the United States, which he wrote with Anna Schwartz. Unlike Edmund Phelps, this man argued that there is a natural rate of unemployment. The theory of monetarism was developed by, for 10 points, what Chicago School Nobel laureate who wrote Capitalism and Freedom. And that is Milton Friedman. Number 38, which will be the last in this installment of the video. We'll have a second half in another video. It is a bonus. 38. The idea that this variable increasing would lead to lower wages is known as the iron law of this variable. For 10 points each. Name this variable whose exponential increase was thought to portend poverty and famine. And that is population. Part B, this economist worried about the effects of linearly increasing food supply and a geometrically increasing population in his essay on the principle of population. And that is Thomas Malthus. Malthus's work inspired the subsistence theory of wages, which was advanced by this author of Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And that, of course, is David Ricardo. So, second half, starting with 39, will be upcoming in the next video.